Welcome back to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and I'm grateful that you're joining us for week 3 as we study the New Testament together. As we continue, remember, this isn't about getting through the scriptures, it's about letting the scriptures get into us. 10 minutes a day, faithfully offered, creates room for quiet transformation. So today we're in Matthew 14 and 15. And these chapters hold grief and grace side by side. Fear rises, hunger presses, questions sharpen. And through it all, we're going to watch what Jesus does, not when life is easy, but when life presses in hard. So today, listen for 2 things: the compassion of Christ and the way faith can survive a storm. So let's begin. Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 to 12 is all about grief without bitterness. Matthew tells us that John the Baptist is killed. Herod orders it. And in Matthew chapter 14, verse 10, it says, "And he sent and beheaded John in the prison." Now, for those of you who do not know who John is, he was Jesus' cousin. He's the forerunner, a faithful witness. When Jesus hears the news, Matthew writes in verse 13, "When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart." Now, so Jesus here withdraws and he grieves. Now, this matters because the Son of God does not rush past sorrow. Grief is not a lack of faith. It is a human response to loss. So what's the principle here? Taking space to grieve is not weakness. It is honesty before God. Next, we're going to visit verses 13 to 21, where compassion interrupts the grief. Even though Jesus seeks solitude, the people followed him on foot in Matthew verses 14 and 13. And Matthew says something remarkable here. In verse 14, Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them. Now here, grief does not harden Jesus. He does not turn people away. Instead, compassion rises up in the middle of his own pain. Then comes the feeding of the 5,000. In verses 17, the disciples say, "We have here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." Then Jesus takes what feels insufficient, gives thanks, and shares it. In verse 20, it says, "And they did all eat and were filled." Compassion multiplies what seems too small. Here is something to reflect on. Where do I feel empty or stretched thin right now? Can I trust Christ with what feels like not enough? Next, we're in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, where fear on the water takes place. Now, later that night, the disciples are at sea. The ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves. That's verse 24. Jesus comes toward them, and Jesus, in verse 25, went unto them walking on the sea. Now here they are all afraid, and Jesus, he yells out and says in verse 27, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." Here in verse 27, Peter steps out in faith. He gets out of the boat, but when he notices the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And then he cries out, "Lord, save me," in verse 30. And Matthew tells us in verse 31, immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him. Now here Jesus does not shame sinking faith. He catches it. So what's the principle? Faith does not mean never sinking. It means knowing who to call when you do. Next, in Matthew 14, verses 34 to 36, it's all about touching the wounded. Now, in verse 36, when Jesus reaches land, they besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And then in verse 36, Matthew adds, "As many as touched were made perfectly whole." Now, notice here that Jesus is still approachable, still accessible, and still willing. Next, in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 to 9, it's all about the tradition versus the heart. Verse 8, Jesus responds by quoting Isaiah. These people draw nigh unto me with their mouth, but their heart is far from me. Jesus is not rejecting tradition. He is protecting the heart. Religion without love becomes empty. So what's the principle? God values sincere hearts more than flawless religious performance. Next is what Jesus teaches about what truly defiles a person. In Matthew 15, verses 10 to 20. In verse 11, Jesus teaches the crowd, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which is cometh out of the mouth. Jesus traces behavior back to its source. Words reveal what lives inside, and healing always begins there. Next, in verses 21 to 28, where there's persistent faith. Now here we learn about a Canaanite woman who cries out in verse 22, "Have mercy on me, O Lord." Now at first, Jesus is silent in verse 23. She does not leave. She persists. And finally, Jesus says in verse 28, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt." Now here, her faith is not loud. It is steadfast. And the principle here is persistent faith is not demanding. It is trusting God's goodness even when answers are delayed. So let's sit with this for a moment. In Matthew chapter 14 and 15, it shows us a Savior who grieves, who feeds the hungry, who comes towards storms, and who honors quiet, persistent faith. So if today you feel tired or are afraid or unsure, remember this. Jesus still walks towards the storm. He still reaches out his hand, and he still responds to hearts that won't stop trusting him. That's it for today. Thank you for being here. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. If your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next time when we continue walking with Matthew in Matthew chapter 16 to 17. Until then, God bless.